Good afternoon, good evening to everybody joining our call today. My name is John Wilton. It's a pleasure to see you all on the call today. Today's webinar really is focused on demystifying corporate sustainability reports. So we're doing that in conjunction with the GICP and Fitch Learning. I'm a director here at the GICP, and we also have my colleague Catherine Beelin, who's a faculty director with Fitch Learning. She's focused on corporate credit, financial institutions, and sustainable finance. So, Catherine, I'll hand over to you to give us some background on yourself.
Great. Thank you so much, John. And thank you to the GICP for inviting me to chat with everyone today. I'm really excited to be with all of you from around the world. I'm based in New York City, and as John said, I am a faculty trainer for Fitch in the area of corporate credit, financial institutions, and sustainable finance. So professionally, I'm actually a corporate lender. My experience is at private banks, but also supranational development organizations. And I really found my passion when I was lending money to corporates and banks in support of climate resiliency projects.
So, we're going to have a quick poll come up in a minute, which is just to give everybody a bit of context on where things stand at the moment, how familiar you are with CSR reporting. And just to give you an overview of the format for today, we're going to start off with a fireside chat between myself and Catherine, and then we're going to follow that up with a Q&A session. So as we're going through the conversation, please do send your questions in via the Q&A function, and we'll answer as many of them as we can at the end of the session. So looking at the poll at the moment, people who do and don't read the ESG reports at the moment, we'll leave that open for a little bit longer. Just to kick things off, Catherine. So I think there are quite a lot of different terms that float around. We've got things like sustainability, impact, climate, CSR reports. Why are there so many different titles?
Good question. Good question to kick things off with. The answer is there is actually no difference. And the reason there are so many names is because we don't have a standard naming convention. There are nuances, but effectively there is no naming convention. As you said, we see reports titled Sustainability Report, Impact Report, ESG Report, CSR, which stands for Corporate Social Responsibility, Climate Report. The choice of words doesn't materially define the information inside, with one caveat. There are nuances. We might see one company publishing something called the Climate Impact Report and another one publishing a CSR report. And if that were the case, we could reasonably expect the Climate Impact Report is exclusively focused on addressing climate related issues.
Yep.
Whereas that CSR report is likely to be broader. It will talk about the S of ESG and community types of conversations. And I guess I would say that the fact that there is no universal naming convention speaks to the lack of standardization around this topic, right? If we were reading a company's annual report or an audited financial statement, we would understand what that content includes and the order of items in that report. That's not the case for these reports.
I ended the poll just
Hmm.
as we had almost, again, a 50-50 split. We've got 48% saying yes and 52% saying no. So hopefully we can help the audience today just to get a bit more clarity on what we're looking at here. So bringing it back on topic. So if there isn't a material difference between all of those terms, do you have a preference on which one you use?
Yeah, I do. So I actually prefer using the term sustainability because to me that speaks to the myriad of factors that impact a company's sustainable business model. We all understand that something is sustainable because it exists and grows over the long term. And when an analyst is looking at a company's business model, we are seeking to understand what that model is, whether it's viable over the medium to long term, whether the credit obligation can be paid back, right? Is that through growth? Are they taking on additional leverage and so on? So I like to use the term sustainable because it refers to the E, the S, and the G, plus so many other factors.
So do all corporates publish these reports? And if so, where would we find them?
First, not all, many, 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 and increasingly many are publishing these reports. And where we find them? So give me a moment to explain. Sometimes we do find them where we think we'll find them, but other times we do actually have to dig. And that is an example of that lack of standardization is a legitimate industry issue on this topic. So some companies actually incorporate their sustainability report within the annual report itself. I was just looking at AB InBev last week, and in their case, they have folded in the E, the S, and the G within their annual report. There are chapter headings in the table of contents. Other companies issue a completely separate report for that same period, and that link might be found on the investor page, or it might be found under an entirely different tab or web page titled something like Our Impact. And a real example of that was Pepsi. So, looking at a different beverage company, you have to go to Pepsi's Our Impact page. And within that, you see a summary report, you see a detailed report, you see a metric report, and then you even see appendices and references to regulatory frameworks like TCFD and so on. So the answer is it all depends. You really need to make sure you're doing your due diligence and you are looking for all reports and data disclosures.
I think I can probably assume some of the answers are coming up here, but what do we typically find in one of those reports?
Yeah, so all sorts of things. So broadly, we would definitely expect to see identification of the most relevant ESG issues, and those are what we are calling material factors. And around those material topics, we want to see management's discussion. We want to understand the relevance, the challenges, the strategy, the progress towards goals, right? The CEO is going to share his vision for a sustainable company, governance around climate risk, and so on. And we want to see discussion of these material issues accompanied by data, whether the data is granular or summary level. We want to see that it supports what management is telling us. That data can be presented as an absolute amount. It can be presented as progress towards some future goal. So often, a company will set a baseline year, maybe 2019, and let's say we're talking about carbon emissions. They will set that baseline year and then share information about absolute amounts of scope 1, 2, 3 carbon emissions. And they're aiming to report on progress towards a future goal, perhaps 2030 and so on. We would expect to see broadly information related to regulatory disclosure requirements, right? So whether it's TCFD, CSRD, and so on. It could also be voluntary frameworks, so or ideals of some kind. So they'll share information about alliance with UN SDGs and so on. Something we really need to watch out for, if I can take a moment, is companies that identify way too many material issues. The idea here is that best practice is for a company to engage their stakeholders, customers, suppliers, industry peers, and so on, map out material issues, but a company shouldn't prioritize all of them. Otherwise, they're not priorities. We do want to see a shorter list of material ESG topics that are prioritized. They should reflect the most relevant and achievable ones for the company to focus on in that short to medium term. And really, many companies do struggle with sustainability because they're trying to address too many issues at once. This leads to scattered efforts, and those scattered efforts fail to generate meaningful results. And as a credit analyst, we are definitely looking for meaningful results, right? Um, there are various ways of doing this, lots of methodologies. I just read one literally a few days ago. It was something about a four lens model. I'm not in any way promoting it, but it was a four lens model. It was a particular methodology that was recommended. So, viewing a business through four lenses, I think it was business values, purpose, stakeholder influence, and then science and technology. And the overlapping topics within those four lenses represents a company's priorities. It's just an example, but we want to see that report narrowed down.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
And is that sort of, if we look back at those criteria you just laid out, is that what you categorize as a best practice version of an ESG report, or are there other things that you would also add to it?
Companies can definitely go the extra mile. And they do this by providing easily accessible, granular detail on data, as well as disclosing how that progress is accomplished. So, for example, let's stay in the area of beverage companies, right? So, a water is a material issue for beverage companies. Soda and beer are primarily made of water, plus water as a resource is used in the manufacturing process, and it's a waste product. So, a great report is clearly identifying that water is a material issue, and it's providing absolute water volumes for us and efficiency metrics for global operations, and then by regions, including high water stress areas. Right those would be drought regions of the world, and that company is going to set baseline years, and they're going to target absolute reductions and really aggressive efficiency ratios, setting even more stringent targets for operations, for example, in those drought areas. And really, hopefully, better practice, they might even disclose R&D and CapEx related to these projects. And this is really helpful for an analyst because it helps us see how much of the R&D or CapEx is related to water efficiency, right? That upfront cost now to change a manufacturing process or invest in a new technology, the idea is that there are long-term efficiencies that result in these long-term cost reductions. And we want data in those reports that helps that credit analyst prove the relationship.
Thanks, Catherine.
Mhm.
So, if we put ourselves in the shoes of an analyst, how should they be using the information they can glean from these reports in their day jobs?
So the information is additive to our traditional credit analysis, right? We are reviewing a company's business. Um, For example, we can use the reports to determine whether a company is a true leader in this particular space. Is sustainability part of its brand offering, strategic plan? How much does the initiative cost? And at what point in time in the future do we see these financial benefits from those investments? Do their actions enable revenue growth, pricing power, broader consumer demographics, maybe access to brand new markets? Maybe their products solve a new problem, right? A climate problem. Are they capturing market share from the competition? All of that information in the reports that's additive to the regular questions that a credit analyst is going to pose. Um, One thing that we also that's really important that we can use is this peer comparison. So peer comparison is always foundational to traditional credit analysis. Information that we see in the ESG report is additive. We're looking to see how does the company compare with peers across measurable data. Are our company's investments paying off relative to those peers? Is our company a leader? Or are they behind, right? By the way, they could be reporting really great progress, but they're actually behind their peers who are doing an
Yep.
even better job, right? And then one last thing that we really do that's super useful is engaging in what's called an intensity metric analysis. So basically, we take the data that is reported and we create ratios. So we can take any data point, let's say it's carbon emissions or renewable energy, and we're comparing that with some kind of financial metric, maybe revenues. We're creating a dynamic ratio with an E or an S metric in the numerator and some financial metric in the denominator. And when we do that, sometimes the picture isn't quite as rosy as it seemed in the report because we can have rapid corporate growth that comes at the expense of an ESG efficiency metric. It can't keep up with that growth rate. And that analysis is telling us a story that's more helpful in the same way if we looked at a company bragging about, top line revenue growth, but when we look at the gross and operating margins, we're seeing a narrowing and some pressure. So that intensity analysis using ESG data with financial data actually gives us a really dynamic picture of relative performance. And that's a really helpful context for a credit analyst.
So, if we look at the reports within the context of credit analysis, what are the pros and cons? The sort of the biggest drawbacks, but also the biggest benefits of using ESG reports.
So definitely one big benefit is really that having these reports, well, credit analysis requires us to formulate this holistic understanding of a company and where they're going and, ultimately whether they can, pay back that credit obligation. And the ESG reports are additive to that process, right? They do provide this contextual information about the whole company's performance, their strategies, risk management. Metrics are telling us the story, especially when we overlay those in the context of financial performance so we can see that dynamic intensity. And sometimes we actually get numbers, right? So we're told how much this costs, and we get to see how the initiatives are costing money up front, but there's long-term value creation, right? Those R&D programs, innovations. Is the company borrowing to finance those initiatives and so on? So that's a really great benefit. I would say the number one drawback right now is definitely the lack of standardization that I mentioned before.
Yep.
Um, it's not just what to call the reports or where to find them. It's more than that. The organization within reports don't have conventions. So we see completely different, setups when we look across different reports. And many metrics don't have standard definitions. So that does mean that many metrics often are not actually comparable if you're trying to do it on your own across a peer group. Some are. So for example, scope 1, 2, 3 emissions, those are standardized. But we could easily see companies reporting a metric, let's say around renewable energy, and I'm very excited. But when I go to look at a peer, I don't actually have quite the same definition in the report. And that means that my data is not apples to apples. And that's a hindrance to that my desire to compare across peers.
Thank you. Um, So if we sort of take a step back for a minute and look at ESG and sustainable finance as a concept, um, do we have a primary driver there? Are we primarily interested in investment returns or managing sustainability risk, or is it a balance of factors?
Yeah, great question, John. We hear that a lot. So if we focus on the E of the ESG, really what we're talking about, the main driver here is climate risk itself. And climate risk has two components. One is the physical risk of climate change, and the other are the risks associated with what we're calling this global energy transition, right? We're in a paradigm shift. So think of the LA wildfires last month or the Valencia floods last year. Those represent physical risk. And then the world is also running or trying to run two parallel energy systems. We're scaling down fossil fuel dependence and scaling up renewable energy as technology at cost and scale allows. So, climate risk in both of these forms is essentially driving sustainable finance efforts. And it is that ecosystem of stakeholders who sit at that precipice of climate risk. They're driving these efforts to finance climate resiliency and mitigation and adaptation. Those stakeholders are most certainly, I always say number one, insurance companies,
Yeah,
financial institutions. We've got insurance companies and banks, and they're sitting really at this precipice. Governments as well, whether we're sovereign, municipalities, cities, regulators, consumers, lawyers, a lot of lawyers involved these days. So they're driving this. And you asked whether investment returns are a primary driver. My way of thinking about this is that any action taken by a company to mitigate a risk or solve a problem or to turn a kind of a challenge into an opportunity, what we tend to see eventually, if we can be patient, we see that medium to long term financial benefit. So it is that medium to long term risk management that confers this financial benefit that all financiers are looking for, whether we're talking about investors or lenders. And remember that risk equals liability and cost. So I think those are the big drivers.
thank you.
Mhm.
So we're nearly at the end of the fireside chat side of things. Just a very quick reminder to people: if you've got questions, please do start putting them into the Q&A side of things, and we'll start to address those in a minute. But if we just try to sort of look at the conversation and sum it up, it would be great to have a few key takeaways from you. And then also maybe just to get the crystal ball out and to look into 2025, it'd be great to sort of say, are there any key trends that you think that we should be looking out for?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. So let's say trends and takeaways. So definitely number one takeaway is that understanding ESG reporting and layering it into your credit analysis is completely additive, right? It's also really important to understand the what and the why of what your company is spending time, money, and human resources to do. Whether it's the actual initiatives that they're talking about to improve something like product circularity or source more renewable energy, or it could just be the report itself, right? If a company is taking the time to collect data and issue a 200-page report, that is meaningful. And my perspective is that a 200-page report is so meaningful that it would be a material omission on my part as an analyst to not read it. I would say another big takeaway is definitely look for best in class ESG reporting among your company's peers. And this will help you analyze your company's sustainability footprint, the quality of the reporting, and really substantiate your company's strategic vision and what they say their leadership aims are. There really is great variety across reports, and it's really helpful to see the differences. Often I am looking at a company and I see that their peers are doing a better job of something. In terms of 2025, everyone is asking for robust, clear, and credible reporting
Yeah.
with easily locatable granular data. We're broadly moving in that direction, but we are, of course, still lacking conventions. Another trend is increasing regulatory disclosure requirements across that global landscape. We see a lot of movement, but for example, just to focus on two, here in the US, we have California rules in the pipeline, and in Europe, we have CSRD. And those are great examples because both of those require companies that aren't necessarily headquartered in their jurisdiction to comply with disclosure per
Yeah.
certain thresholds. Yeah, one more trend I think for 25 that I see a lot of is corporate transition planning. It's super
Mhm.
important. I see a lot of banks, accounting firms, law firms, and consulting companies really working very hard to help their corporate clients understand what the global landscape is, help them define that business strategy, risk management, and compliance with these reporting requirements.
Thank you, Catherine. That's been really helpful. I can see we've got a few questions flowing in already, so I'll kick off with some of those. So the first one that we have is: are you concerned that other big firms might follow in the footsteps of BP and reverse away from investment in renewable to please their shareholders?
Sorry, just the second half of that question,
Uh,
reverse away
so
from.
are we concerned that other big firms might follow in the footsteps of BP and
Mhm.
reverse away from investment in renewables to please their shareholders?
I definitely look shareholders are in the ecosystem, and so companies definitely there are there's tensions in terms of how they prioritize stakeholder concerns, and shareholders are part of that stakeholder universe. I would just go back to a couple things. Number one, as I said before, climate risk is defining everything that we're doing, and Mother Nature. So that climate risk, the warming of the planet, and the increasing frequency, magnitude, and even geographic locations, right, of these climate risk events, they don't change based on what shareholders are asking for, and so on.
Yeah.
So that's really the main answer here. Am I concerned that other companies, they may, right? I don't have a crystal ball. They absolutely may. What
Mm.
helps me sleep well at night is knowing that all of those are short term movements, short-term pressure. And what we really are talking about here is something that is a medium to long-term goal. Climate risk is here and doesn't depend on that per se. And yeah, so I expect. Also, I also like to point out that energy transitions in the past. So from I guess it was wood to coal and then coal to electricity, they tend to take numbers, and I don't quote me, but somewhere between 50 to kind of 75, 80 years, global transitions, right? So, when we think about the energy paradigm that we're in right now and this attempt at transitioning, we're going to take a few steps forward, also a few steps to the side, and several steps backwards over the
Yep.
50 to 70-year time period. Hopefully, we will have progressed forward.
Thank you. So there's relatively good follow-on to that, which is: can you give some commentary on current attitudes towards ESG in North America?
Yeah, great question. I'm not surprised by that. I think it's at top of everyone's mind around the world right now, the US environment. Maybe the best way to think about that is let's just step back and remind ourselves first of what US policy comprises. So, US policy reflects this combination of federal action or inaction, as well as state action and inaction. And so I like to present this as this idea of a patchwork quilt, right? So we looked at a map of states. We would see a lot of different colors, and some are have pro legislation and pro policies, and some don't, and so on. So it looks like this quilt. And if we layer on top of that, we have this federal landscape, which changes every 4 years. So it makes it a pretty complex, challenging environment to work in. If we look back over the past 4 years, there were a host of federal policies that did promote business activities, corporates, banks, consumer, and residential, all related to sustainable finance or sustainability, right? Maybe renewable energy or climate resiliency, technology. That federal landscape has certainly changed since the new administration took office in January. It is a full reversal of the course we were on. So, just as an example, withdrawing the entire offshore continental shelf from wind energy leasing, very big deal because there were a lot of projects already there in the pipeline. Or freezing, green energy loans. Again, very big deal. So it's kind of a dead stop we're at. The landscape is I cannot be it's very confusing right now. And on top of that, everyone is suing everyone. So a lot of these actions are running through the court system. So it's I think my word is chaotic. I think many here would agree it's chaotic. That said, there are some things to note. So I would say, again, climate risk is the driver behind sustainability, and that
Mhm.
intensification of the climate risk, frequency, magnitude, geographic expansion is not slowing down because of political swings. We also do still have state action in the absence of the federal support. So, although that national landscape is chaotic, we still see state policies incentivizing climate resiliency, energy efficiency, and so on. And we certainly expect that trend to continue. States and cities are bearing this burden. We are seeing, of course, there's always the leader states here, California,
Yep.
New York, and
Yep.
so on. But the more of those, what we tend to see is, if New York enacts something, others follow. So we really do expect that to continue. There might be some lawsuits, but we expect that to continue. continue. Also, the jurisdictional ESG disclosure requirements I mentioned a few minutes ago, that requires companies, even American companies, to report. So, for example, that California disclosure rule or CSRD in EU, both sets of those rules do require companies, which meet the ones that meet thresholds, to to measure and consider and report on ESG or climate risk. And this is only going to continue. So that helps drive the overall big picture decarbonization effort.
Thank you.
Mhm.
We have one more at the moment, and again, do feel free to send more in. We've got, how is the US landscape likely to influence global attitudes? So I guess another follow on from that, really.
Yeah, I think the U.S. landscape definitely is the chaos here. I think is a topic of discussion for the rest of world. We actually saw, so I think, the easy answer is that it does put more pressure on, rest of world to not just come up with solutions, but to finance those solutions. And we actually began to see a little bit of that. The last COP met in November. So that's the conference of parties where, sovereigns, but also corporates and, leaders are gathering to talk about, climate. And at the November session, wound up being a little bit disappointing in that there was an aim of a commitment to raise X amount of financing per year, and what was agreed on basically fell short. So we began to see a little bit of this. Probably everyone else is going to have to step up, maybe private
Yeah.
credit, private financing, and so on. To be fair, that particular COP met the same week of the U.S. election, so I think that also clouded how things went. But yeah, I think we would certainly expect to see more space, more need for the private sector to step in and fill the gap,
Okay.
which is an opportunity, right? A business
Yes.
opportunity. So
Yeah. So we've got another one here, which is, are there any good sources of information to benchmark companies against?
I guess I would answer that two ways. If I'm looking at a company in a particular sector, I'm always looking for sector reports. So, those reports can be provided by rating agencies such as Fitch. But yeah, also, we have lots of other organizations. So, for example, there's one called Ceres. I pronounce it Ceres. I'm probably mispronouncing it. CERES. They have great industry reports where they're really monitoring particular industries, all with the vision towards the kind of climate risk or especially the E of ESG. And so those are really helpful. Oftentimes they're doing that work of putting the data together across peer companies, so we don't have to do it ourselves. And those reports are giving us a sense for what's necessary, looking forward in the future. And then I would also say, don't forget, we have a whole landscape of ESG ratings.
Yep.
So there's lots of different ESG rating providers, including Fitch. We have our own. The ESG ratings, you could then use those to compare across companies as kind of best metric.
Mhm.
One word of caution is that unlike credit ratings, ESG ratings all look at different angles of an ESG picture. So, for example, Fitch's ESG relevance rating speaks to how relevant are a company's top material issues to its credit rating, right? So some of those material issues might be really important, but they may not impact their credit rating. That's a perspective. Another ESG rating provider might be opining on where that company sits relative to its peers. So it might just simply be looking at a sector and saying, we're giving a rating and these are the industry leaders in this sector versus the industry laggards. And so just the word of caution is that from an ESG rating perspective, I find them all helpful perspectives, but just be aware that they are all different. So you need to know what is it that you're really looking for when you're looking at those ratings.
Great, thank you.
Mhm.
So we have another one here, and I think it might be looking more at the sort of naming conventions. And if we're not answering this one correctly, then please feel free to throw something else out into the Q&A. But we've got one which is, what's the relationship between sustainability and climate risk?
Yeah. So as I was talking about before, when I spoke about my preference, I like to use the word sustainability.
Yeah.
So something that is sustainable, whether we're talking about a business or our gardens, we're talking about it being viable and being able to sort of grow over the medium to long term. And by the way, that growth needs to comprise risk management and resource management and so on, right? So we want the growth, but we also need to make sure that that's possible because the resources still exist. And so the relationship between climate, or the E of ESG, and sustainability is that that's a really big part of sustainability. We need to, as I use beverage companies, we need the water resources that they're taking as as a resource for their manufacturing and their product. We need those water resources to be sustainable over the long term, and especially important if they have a production facility somewhere, maybe in North Africa, which is a drought
Yeah.
region, right? So they're utilizing that fresh water at the expense of what's available for the local community, for us to drink a soda. So that's why that's the climate, or the E component of this long-term sustainable business vision, right? So how to make the best product over the long term, while ensuring that those resources that are necessary still exist in the future, and that we're using as little of them as possible. And by the way, we're using as little of them as possible. That's a benefit for the community. But if you think about that as your raw ingredient, your raw material cost of goods sold, over time, this is a cost efficiency.
Great, thank you. We've got one more if you have time, which is what about greenwashing? How much is there, and how do we identify it?
Companies have to be very careful about greenwashing. Greenwashing refers to either intentionally or inadvertently misleading stakeholders about how green an activity is. In some jurisdictions now, we do have a lot more laws today than we did, a few years back. When you heard a lot more about it. For example, the SEC has a naming convention and so on. In some jurisdictions, an entity can be fined, or worse, if a regulatory body determines that there's greenwashing. They can actually also be subject to litigation, and this can come from unexpected sources. So, for example, I think it was just around year end, New York State filed a lawsuit against a Brazilian meat giant. Whatever, I forget the name of the company, the biggest one out there, alleging greenwashing. I think that company was seeking a listing on the New York Stock Exchange, and I'm in New York's our attorney general. She filed a lawsuit. They were claiming to be net zero or something. I think in terms of trend, besides the increasing rules around it, verification is increasingly a trend, and
Mm.
we're going to see more of that in the future. That's a really helpful way to assure stakeholders that the data and information and report is accurate and supportable. So that's a good thing. Um, and then I would say the risk of greenwashing is another reason why analyzing that ESG report, so reading it and really thinking about what it's telling us, is helpful for that credit analysis that we're doing. Our analysis of that report gives us a clearer picture of the company's actual sustainability footprint and their efforts, which sometimes can be different than the product packaging, saying something is green. Last point, and this is my term. It's not an official industry term. It's not Fitch's term or officially GICP. I use the term opaqueness, right?
Mhm.
I see a lot of opaqueness in reports.
Yeah.
The best reports have specificity, transparency, and granular detail. A lot of reports are very heavy on the photos, the graphics, and percentages. And percentages might look great, but they do not tell us enough information. Think about it this way: a company can set a goal for a target. Let's pretend that they set a goal for scope one carbon emissions. But that type of company might be in an industry like a service industry that does not have a high scope one carbon emission footprint to begin with. So this may not be a material goal to set. Also,
Yeah.
the company can also choose a baseline year, set some goal for a target year, and then they're reporting on this great percentage of progress with wonderful photos. But what if they actually set a relatively low target reduction amount
Yep.
as the goal? So it would be very easy to show a progress via a percentage, but the absolute amount may not be material. So these are the kinds of opaqueness that I do see a lot of in reports. I'm a pessimist when it comes to percentage announcements. I always want to see the data that come
Yep.
behind it so I can come to my own conclusion. Mhm.
Great. Catherine, thank you so much for joining us today. And to everyone in the audience, thank you as well. Again, everyone on the call, thank you so much for joining. The next webinar that we're running will be focused specifically on the Global Credit Certificate, which is on the 11th of March. So if you'd like to learn more about that, please do join us. Otherwise, hopefully we'll see you on the next one from this series. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. Thank you, everyone.